Welcome to episode 46 of Refining Rhetoric. I'm your host, Robert Bortons. I'm going to be talking to someone I've known since high school. Saw him at debate, never got as far as he did, but Will Estrada, he is the president of the Parental Rights Foundation. He was an amazing interview, helping us see historically why it's so important for us to fight for our parental rights here in the United States and make sure they're codified in law and not just implied. So you do not want to miss this episode. And of course, we'll practice the 15 tools of learning and talk a little bit about crypto. So let's jump in.
Classical Conversation Studios presents Refining Rhetoric with CEO Robert Bortons, a podcast where faith, business, politics, and classical education meet. Join us as we use the classical tools of rhetoric to seek truth in every arena of life.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Refining Rhetoric. Today, my guest is Will Estrada. Will is the president of parentalrights.org and the Parental Rights Foundation, two nonprofits holding fast to the belief that parents should be able to raise their children without undue government interference. Prior to those leadership roles, Will spent nearly 20 years with HSLDA and just fighting for parental rights. He was a homeschooler. I never got to debate him because I never got far enough. I always got eliminated a lot earlier. But we've known Will since high school. So, Will, welcome to the show.
Great to be on. Thank you so much for having me.
Will, you're an awesome debater, so we'll throw you a softball to begin with. How do you define truth?
Oh, wow. Okay, that is a great question, Robert. And whenever the question of truth comes up, I'm reminded of Sir Francis Bacon. He was the Attorney General of Elizabethan century England. So this is 17th century, and he wrote an essay called Of Truth. And the lines begin, and I think everyone knows those first lines. What is truth, said jesting Pilate, and did not wait for an answer. And of course, that's the scriptural passage of where Pontius Pilate asks Jesus during his trial, what is truth? And that says that he immediately went out to the crowd. And Robert, I'm a Christian. And as a Christian, I believe that it's impossible for fallen man to fully understand truth absent revelation from God. And so that reminds me of John 14:6, where Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father except through me. And that's really the first stage. Now, I do believe that there is common grace, and when we think of truth, there are certain immutable facts, that the sun rises, that is truth, that life is precious, that's something that's innate in every single person's heart. I think Scripture makes it clear that the heavens declare the glory of God, and so even through nature and even people who don't know Jesus as their Savior, who don't know God, who don't know that full epitome of truth, they can still obtain certain truths, scientific advancements. But when you speak of what is truth and that hunger that we all have to know the truth, I think it begins with Jesus and with God and with Christianity.
I love that answer. I completely agree with it. I love the relationship to Francis Bacon, obviously well-educated man. So I was curious. You got your law degree. You're a thought leader for parental rights. Did debate in high school form your decision to pursue a law degree?
You know what's funny?
How did you get to where you are today?
Robert, what's funny is I was a very weird kid. I wanted to be a fighter. Well, I wanted to be a farmer, then wanted to be a firefighter, all those kind of things. And but then at around 11, I said to myself, I want to be someone who can right injustices, and so I want to be a lawyer. So here I am, little 11-year-old, wants to be a lawyer. And so that desire to be a lawyer actually inspired me to get involved in debate. I was homeschooled. There were 8 of us kids, grew up in rural Pennsylvania, and my parents weren't really big into debate. They said, there's 8 of us kids, of course, and they're like, all you do is argue and debate. We don't want you to learn anymore. But we got a hold of some debate textbooks, and we said, well, we want to do debate, and basically dragged our parents along at our very first debate tournament in Downingtown, Pennsylvania. My brother and I had never been to a debate tournament before, never seen a debate before. We basically just read a couple books on how to do debate, And we qualified for nationals. We won the debate tournament. And at that point, even my parents said, well, we're hooked on this. You guys obviously have some skills. And so never qualified for nationals ever again after that, but we had a great time. And I think it really helped me know for certain that I loved the law. I loved research. I loved kind of the argumentative process, the pursuit of truth, and that I wanted to be a lawyer.
Well, we are certainly glad you're on our side. So
I'm really glad I'm on your side, Robert. I think I'd be a kind of a miserable, pedantic, annoying person if I were on the other side, actually.
Well, you fight for parental rights, and that could mean a lot of things. So, what does that mean to you as the leader of the Parental Rights Foundation?
Robert, that's a great question. And at its heart, parental rights is the understanding that children need guidance. I think everyone agrees with that. But that parents, not bureaucrats, should be the ones who have the ultimate decision-making authority. And so that is the rub, really, of when it comes down to these arguments that you see in news, in politics, in our legislatures, in our schools. Everyone at their heart understands that children need guidance, that children need to be protected and led, particularly younger children. Once they get up into teen years, there's certain freedom that kids have. But the debate is truly at who should be influencing and guiding kids. And so a lot of the people on the other side who say, we believe in children's rights, they don't really believe in children's rights. If they did, they would be fine with 12-year-olds buying AR-15s. And of course, none of them really do. What they really want is they want to be able to have quote unquote, the experts, the elites leading and guiding children into the decisions that the experts and the elites think are best for children. And that is the heart of what parental rights is. It's who's going to be leading and guiding, who's going to be raising children, who's going to be raising the next generation. Should it be their parents or should it be elites, bureaucrats? And that is the heart of the debate. And that's why I'm constantly, and at our work at Parental Rights Foundation, we're constantly reminding people of this is not some sort of children versus parents. This is who is going to be doing the upbringing of children.
But don't bureaucrats love your kids more than you do?
Oh, they say that they do, and they say we know what's best. But at the end of the day, Robert, and every parent knows this, Republican or Democrat, Christian, Muslim, atheist, Jewish, they all know this. No parent wakes up in the morning saying, gee, I can't wait for other people to raise my kids. They love their kids. Every parent, it's innate in their heart. Of course, we're talking about loving parents. There are sociopaths out there who are horrible people who would...
Sure, there's people with mental illnesses and those different things out there.
Right, and that's why you do need to have government to step in if people abuse or harm children. But the vast majority of parents love their children. They give their life for their children. And, you see that regularly in tragic news stories of fires, of moms or dads running into burning buildings and dying. That's something that we take for granted. And I think that's why when we see heroes like firefighters, for example, or even just a passerby in the street do it, it's what makes it so amazing, because this is not a parent, this is someone who doesn't know a child, but it's kind of that innate love of taking care of the vulnerable that we sometimes see. And that's why we hold these people up, like firefighters or passersby who save a child out of a burning building, because that's something that you don't take for granted. And when someone does that, then you hold them up as a hero. But every day, moms and dads, they put their lives on the line, they put their careers, they sacrifice so much for their children. And it's pretty disrespectful, I think, to the sacrifice and love that parents have for their children. Some of the discussion that we see surrounding either education or parental rights or child raising in today's discourse.
Now, would you say parental rights are natural right, or are they found? Is that something that only Bible-believing people believe in? Like, where are parental rights? Where do they come from?
Every society, until really 21st century Western society, let me amend that. Most societies, and I would say freedom-loving societies, have always understood that the family predates government. that the family is the building block of society. You look back on Aristotle. Aristotle was not a believer, but he rightly understood that the family was the building block of society. You look in all the great world religions, whether Christianity or Judaism or Islam, they all teach that the family is the building block of society, that it predates, that those three religions say that God created the family, and that it predates government. There also, though, has been this alternate argument that the government is the most important. And actually, it was another one of the Greek philosophers, Plato, who said that there should be these guardians of the society. And he wrote some pretty troubling things, saying that wives should be in common, that families should be in common, that children with disabilities should be left to die, and that the guardians would raise the children in common because that was best for society. Now, Aristotle strongly disagreed with Plato. You look at John Locke, you look at the Blackstone, the men who influenced our founders, and they realized that government is subordinate to parents and to families. And that's why, Robert, you have in the Declaration of Independence that our founders wrote, we hold these truths to be inalienable, that we're endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that these rights come from the laws of nature and of nature's God. And so they properly understood that the parental rights don't come from the government, that they predate the government, that they predate the Constitution, and that they're God-given. So in contrast to that, you have totalitarian regimes and governments that say that all rights come from the state. And I'm thinking of Mao and communist China, or Plato with his totalitarian thinking of how you would have this ideal society. And you have it creeping into modern-day 21st century Western America as well, that these rights are government-created. We've talked about Elizabeth Bartholet, a Harvard professor who has strongly criticized homeschooling because at its heart, she says, Elizabeth Bartholet, professor at Harvard, says that there really should be no such thing as parental rights, that government should decide. So it really is this clash of civilizations of where do parental rights come from? Do they predate government, or are they created by government? And wherever you fall on that, it's going to very much influence your view of family, law, of society, and the conversation that we're having today of parental rights.
Now, I know we hear a lot of parental rights from the right wing of our political organizations, but of course, as you mentioned earlier, rightly so, that I think anyone with a child, whether Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, all of them believe that they love their children and want the best for them. So do you notice, are there other organizations that are fighting for parental rights, or is it really, parental rights versus child rights as far as what we see on the political spectrum?
That's a great question, Robert. And this is really, I think, one of those situations where the politicians are divorced from the reality of ordinary moms and dads across the country. We did a survey, Parental Rights Foundation did a survey last year, so May of 2022, and we asked the question, should loving parents make decisions for their children, or should it be government bureaucrats? And 83% of Americans, this was 83% of Democrats, it was actually 90% of Republicans, 85% of independents, all said no, it should be loving parents. It shouldn't be government bureaucrats making decisions for children. And it was a very interesting result, because if you were to poll politicians, particularly from one major party, I think you'd find a very small number of those politicians, particularly in Washington, D.C., who would support that concept that loving parents should make decisions rather than bureaucrats. But yet the voters are pretty universal. There's very few things, Robert, in modern politics that gets 83% of people from both parties supporting it. Parental rights is one of those. So it's been a little disappointing, a little surprising to see if there aren't more organizations that are left of center that are advancing parental rights. But the good news is that in components of parental rights, they are there. And so we work at Parental Rights Foundation very closely with the ACLU, with left of center organizations at the state and local level, on the issue of protecting parental rights when it comes to child welfare investigations. In that particular component of parental rights, that aspect of parental rights, it's universal that organizations, whether they're left, right, center, are realizing that the child welfare industry in America today is hopelessly broken. Instead of seeking to preserve families and provide support to families who are struggling, it's kind of this one-size-fits-all approach of let's remove children, let's have mandatory reporters, let's make everyone a reporter. If you see something, say something. And it has only been in basically the last 10 years that there's been an understanding of child welfare investigations themselves cause trauma to children. And we should be very careful before we send a government investigator who has the power to remove a child from a home to do an investigation unless a child is truly at risk of abuse or neglect. And so it's been very exciting to work with a lot of these left of center organizations to provide more due process protections for innocent families, to try and rein in some of the overly broad neglect laws that we have in this country, where you let your 10-year-old walk home from the bus stop 100 yards, some nosy neighbor who might not like you calls social services, and suddenly there's a government investigator at your door. So we've been working with left of center organizations to pass bipartisan laws to say, no, you could make a parenting decision. Some of our listeners may feel uncomfortable letting a 10-year-old walk home from the bus stop. That's fine. But that's a parenting decision that a loving parent may choose to make. And so in some areas, we've really had some good common ground, and we've been able to make a difference in this.
Yeah, I know we've seen some parental rights get passed, and usually it is with bipartisan support because, especially from the elected officials who have kids themselves.
Yes. I was testifying on a bill in Annapolis, Maryland yesterday, a fundamental parental rights bill, and it was very interesting to see a couple of the speakers who opposed it. None of them had children themselves, and I think having kids changes you. You realize that a lot of things you thought you knew, you don't really know until you're there making the decisions. It makes you more humble. My wife and I have two kids, two boys, 10 and 5, and there's certainly a lot of things that I thought I knew that I didn't know until I became a dad myself.
I might argue that we have parental rights as a natural law. It's part of the Constitution. So why is it important that we get these enshrined in government institutions if these are natural rights of parents?
It's a great question, Robert, and I think it goes to something that happened in our country in the 1780s. As you and our listeners remember, in 1787, in the Constitutional Convention, the United States Constitution was born. And there was a debate after the Constitution was approved about whether we needed to have a Bill of Rights. Of course, the Bill of Rights are amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Remember, the Constitution didn't grant any rights, didn't even protect any rights of the people. It merely said, we are creating a government. We are going to make specific things that the federal government will follow. It's going to be very, very limited what the federal government can do, and that will be the purpose of the Constitution. And then there was a debate because some of our founders, Robert, said some rights are so important, we need to make sure that they're protected in the Bill of Rights. And it was actually Patrick Henry who said, no, the Constitution was written to just give limited power to the federal government. We don't need a Bill of Rights because if we start protecting certain rights, then what about other unenumerated rights, for example? And Patrick Henry, despite his wisdom, I think he was wrong. And I'm very glad that the Madisonian view of the Bill of Rights prevailed and that we got certain rights enshrined in our Bill of Rights. Think of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Then there's free speech. There's right of the people to peaceably assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances. Think of where we would be today,
we barely have access to the Bill of Rights.
Exactly. The Second Amendment, for example, talks about gun rights. That they should not be abridged, and there's a lot of abridgment going on. So I ask friends because I have come into contact with Patrick Henrys today who are like, we shouldn't have a parent's Bill of Rights. We shouldn't codify parental rights as fundamental in state code. And I'm like, tell me, do you think religious freedom or free speech or gun rights or Fourth Amendment, right to be secure in your person, houses, and effects, or trial by jury, do you think those would be more secure if we didn't have the Bill of Rights or less secure? They think for a moment, and then they're like, well, you're right. And so that is why I think it's so important, even though these are God-given, predating government rights, parental rights, that we do need to protect them in the black and white of the U.S. Constitution. We're working on a parental rights amendment, or in the black and white of state code.
Now, government does have a role and responsibility. The family has a role and responsibility. Churches have a role and responsibility. From a parental rights perspective, what are some of those things that maybe the government does have interest in from keeping children, like you said, maybe abuse and those type of, sad situations?
Well, again, for me, it goes to my Christian background. And Romans 13 says that government is instituted by God and that it is there to be a judgment, a punishment to the evildoer. And so when you have evildoers, whether it's, larcenies, burglaries, or murder, or assaults, or child abuse, then that is a legitimate purpose of the government to step in and to protect the innocent and to punish the guilty. Of course, there needs to be due process. We do have due process in place, constitutional systems to make sure that people are treated fairly. The image of due process that is probably in all of our minds of blindfolded justice, holding the sword in one hand and the equally balanced scales in the other hand. That's how all cases should be handled. But that is why there is a legitimate purpose for government. One thing that we do at Parental Rights Foundation when I'm drafting legislation protecting parental rights, you want to make sure that there's something called strict scrutiny. The over 200 plus years that our constitutional system has been in place, the U.S. Supreme Court has said that there are certain fundamental rights. These are the highest protection of rights. We would think of inalienable rights. Again, harkening back to the Declaration of Independence. And parental rights has been considered one of those fundamental rights, even though it's not specifically referenced. It's an unenumerated or an implied right in the Constitution. But the U.S. Supreme Court has said that it is a fundamental right. And as such, a fundamental right gets strict scrutiny. Strict scrutiny is lawyer talk for the government has to have a compelling state interest, the highest interest. Think of protecting innocent life, for example. And as applied to the individual person or the individual fact scenario, it must be the least restrictive means, narrowly tailored to meet that compelling state interest. So, for example, it would be unconstitutional for the government to say, because one person has abused a child, we need to have government inspectors monitoring every single home of a homeschooling family. You have people like Elizabeth Bartholet saying we should do that, but they haven't really gotten past that would not be constitutional in our system of government. And sometimes I have hostile media interviews and a reporter will be asking me and saying, well, we've got to be protecting children. And I say, hold on a second. You're a reporter. You're protected by the First Amendment. You believe what you're doing is very important. We all know that words can be very damaging. They can incite murder. They can incite a riot. They can incite violence. But we don't, in our system of constitutional protections, we don't require reporters to run what they say by a government censor. So the hostile reporter will kind of pause and say, well, you're right about that. And in the same way, we punish the evildoers, but we leave freedom to you're innocent until proven guilty. That's in our system of government and something we must never lose sight of.
Amen. How are parentalrights.org and the Parental Rights Foundation, are those sister organizations? Are they two separate? Like how do those two operate together?
Yeah, so we've got two web pages, two organizations. I'm the president of both organizations. Parentalrights.org was founded first. We were founded by Mike Farris and some other visionary leaders back in 2007, and technically we were founded as a 501c4 organization. A 501c4 organization is not tax deductible, but it is tax exempt. So if you donate to parentalrights.org, we're very grateful, but you can't get a write-off on your federal income taxes. So in 2014, we realized a lot of the work that we were doing was not legislative, was not lobbying work. Instead, it was litigation work. It was educating the public. It was creating a groundswell of support for parental rights. And our leadership at the time, I was not the president of parentalrights.org, but our leadership said we should create a 501c3 tax-deductible charity organization where people can donate to the Parental Rights Foundation. They can, if they give $1 million, they can get $1 million write-off on their taxes. Of course, always talk to your tax preparer because this should not be construed as the giving of tax advice.
Sure.
But we don't want to get in trouble there.
Yeah, we're not financial advisors. We're not tax advisors. We're none of these things on the show.
Exactly. But talk to your tax preparer, because a donation to a 501c3 charitable organization generally can give you a tax write-off. And so that's where Parental Rights Foundation came from. Since then, we've taken what's called the H election, which allows a 501c3 organization to do a certain amount of lobbying on legislation. So more and more of our work is being done through the Parental Rights Foundation. And parentalrights.org is one of our web pages. You can find out more about our non-tax deductible work, our legislative work, our parental rights amendment, and then parentalrightsfoundation.org. That's our C3, think of like a church, for example. And that's where we're doing a lot of our litigation, a lot of our amicus briefs, a lot of our educating the public about the importance of parental rights.
Now, you talked earlier about a parental rights amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Like, where does that stand? Like, what's that process look like? If we're a listener to this show and we're fired up about what you're saying, like, is there something that they can do to get involved in that?
Absolutely. So parental rights are fundamental. The U.S. Supreme Court has said that for 100 years. 1923, 100 years ago, was the case of Meyer versus Nebraska that first established that parental rights are fundamental. But again, it's an unenumerated right. It's not in the black and white of the U.S. Constitution. And so we are trying to amend the United States Constitution to put, quite simply, the liberty interest of parents to direct the education, upbringing, and care of their children is a fundamental right, to put it into the black and white of the U.S. Constitution. Now, constitutional amendments are hard. They take a 2/3 vote in the House and Senate, then 3/4 of the states have to ratify an amendment. There have only been 27 amendments to the United States Constitution. 10 of those are the original Bill of Rights. So we realize this is a marathon, not a sprint, Robert. But it's incredibly important. The Parental Rights Amendment to the U.S. Constitution is the only thing that will protect these God-given rights for generations to come. So while we're working on that, it's been reintroduced in Congress at House Joint Resolution 38. You can go to parentalrights.org. You can find phone numbers for your members of Congress. Call them, ask them to co-sponsor. While we're working on kind of that generational marathon, though, to amend the Constitution, we're very active through state legislation, through court cases. So we're not letting any grass grow under us while we're working on the constitutional amendment.
No, you guys are very busy. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I mean, we're glad you are out there doing the fight. It's unfortunate.
I like to be busy. Keeps me out of trouble.
Yeah. Idle hands are the devil's workshop.
Yeah, that's
right?
true.
Now, of course, you were homeschooled growing up, and now you're one of America's top leaders defending parental rights. Do you think your education that you had impacted your love for parental rights?
No question of that, Robert. I was very blessed. Of course, I'm the oldest of 8 kids. My dad was a public school teacher. My mom gave up her very promising career at IBM. She was working on the precursors of the internet in the late 70s, early 80s. But she gave up her career to stay home and homeschool us. And both my parents were very, very engaged in our education. They constantly drove us to excel. And that love of learning that I got and my siblings received in our homeschooling is something that I still have to this day of going back to your very first question of seeking truth, of finding truth, because that's ultimately, I think, one of our top purposes in life, to find truth, to find the truth, and then to seek to use that knowledge for the betterment of our neighbors and the people around us.
Growing up, I think you and I both maybe experienced more rub because homeschooling wasn't as popular as is now. Like, did you enjoy being homeschooled? And what was that like? And what have you seen in changes in the homeschooling lifestyle, or homeschooling in general in the United States over the last 20 years or so?
I loved being homeschooled. Of course, several times I was asked about what about socialization. Several times my parents were asked that. And my wife and I weren't planning on homeschooling our kids, actually. We had the paperwork back in 2018 to enroll our first child in public school. And 3 days before the deadline, my wife was like, you know what? Let's just homeschool for the first semester and see how it goes. He's so little still. And I'm like, okay. And we loved it so much. She just said, and my wife was saying, well, let's try the next year. And then the pandemic hit. And then we live in Loudoun County, Virginia, and we have kind of a nutty school board. And so now there's no going back. We're in homeschooling for the long haul. But Robert, never have we been asked any question about socialization. And that kind of funny anecdote, I think, really illustrates the difference. In the 80s, my parents started homeschooling me, and then, of course, being homeschooled through the 90s, homeschooling was still pretty rare. And nowadays, particularly post-pandemic, everyone in the country homeschooled at least for a couple weeks. And some people were like, oh, you're a god among mortals. If you're still homeschooling, it was so hard for me. But the pandemic was really interesting because it showed everyone what homeschool parents do all day. And so for those who are not still homeschooling, many people, of course, the schools opening up, put their kids back in public school or in private school, but they got kind of a taste of homeschooling. And so I think they have much more respect for homeschooling parents. But so many, some percentages say it's as high as 10% of the school-age population now are homeschooling their kids. And so everyone knows homeschoolers. And really, homeschooling is not fringe anymore. It's in the mainstream as a well-respected educational option, right up there with public, private, charter, or homeschools. Those are now the top 4 educational options for K through 12 in our country. And it's incredible.
Yeah, it was fun to help people that, I've seen, people that send their kids back, obviously, but there's so many that have stayed. And I think during the height of it, of course, people define homeschooling differently, but I think most of us said there was about 5 to 6 million people homeschooling, as I guess homeschool traditionalists would call it. And I think that number is still well above 3 million today. So some of them went back, but well above the 2 million or so that were homeschooling pre-pandemic. So, to me, I think it's really strengthened homeschooling and homeschooling rights with just the probably public less likely to support bad homeschooling laws. Have you seen something similar with parental rights after the pandemic and, of course, different mandates and different things going on for young children? Have you seen an uptick in interest in parental rights?
Well, before I answer that question, Robert, I just want to give you and Classical Conversations a shout out. You really are just a leader in this, and Classical Conversations is just doing some tremendous work around the country in helping come alongside parents as they're homeschooling, helping new homeschoolers. So I just want to thank you. You're really making a difference for a generation of children, and I think it can't be said enough. In answer to that question, it's very interesting because I spent 14 years working at the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. I did a lot of work for parentalrights.org and the Parental Rights Foundation over the years, and no one really cared about parental rights. The homeschoolers cared, but among the general population, everyone said, you've got a solution in search for a problem. Parental rights are protected. And it wasn't until the pandemic when, remember, moms and dads are sitting at home doing Zoom work and kids are doing Zoom school, and suddenly they realized, whoa, what is that teacher saying to my children? What are these books you're reading? And if it had not been for the pandemic, I don't actually know if the curtain would have been open to what is going on in public schools. And so since then, it's just been drinking from a fire hose in all actuality. Everyone is discussing parental rights. We've seen parental rights come up in national surveys as a top voting issue. And it really shows that the battle lines are drawn. But interestingly enough, in the public schools, we've won the battle of parental rights for homeschooling. We've won the battle for parental rights in private schooling. And I talk to people sometimes who are discouraged, and I'm like, we're winning. It's really the last bastion of the fight for parental rights is in public schools, and then to a lesser degree in the child welfare space as well. But think of where we've come. Back in the 1920s, they were trying to shut down private schools. Homeschooling wasn't really an option. We've come a long way. The battle is in this last bastion of the public schools.
Mm. Yeah, because if you send, I don't know the specific details, but basically you're signing some of your rights away sometimes currently when you send your kids to a government institution? Is that basically what the argument is, that you've now given the public school, or the teachers are now considered the parents in this instance?
So
What's the argument?
I would argue that should not be the case. But
Right.
you're absolutely right. That is where the courts have come down right now. And so it's a very actually just about 30 minutes before this podcast, I finished up an amicus brief. It's called amicus is Latin, amicus curiae, friend of the court brief, to a very troubling case that came out of the First Circuit. That's up in Massachusetts. It's a federal court case. An 11-year-old child, the school was hiding information about her from the parents, even though the parents said, please don't do this. Don't have therapists talk to our daughter. We have our own therapists that we're working with. And the school completely ignored the parents. And the federal district court said, nope, yeah, parents, if you choose to put your kids in public school, you can't know anything about what's going on with them. And our amicus brief, our friend of the court brief, said, hold the presses, look at the history of parental rights. Even in the public schools, this should not be the case. Now, are we going to win? I don't know. And certainly, if you put your kids in public school, there is going to be a little bit more give and take that you don't have in a private school or a homeschool setting. You have complete freedom there. There has to be reasonableness. I mean, you can't have every parent making demands in the public school, or else the public school setting wouldn't work. But it's complete, in my view, it's completely.
You're not arguing the public setting does work, are you?
No, well, I mean, I'm an advocate for homeschooling, but we have many of the people we're representing.
But if every parent wanted to dictate every single book that was being read in the public school, that would be very difficult.
It would be difficult for the public school. So I get that. But right now,
the literature class needs to have literature picked out by the school board or by the teacher or by some entity. Not all 36 parents can pick out a book for them to read this semester.
But right now, I believe it's weighted against even just parents having a reasonable say in their kids' public schools. And that's why we're filing friend of the court briefs. That's why we're working on many of these issues.
Well, I'm encouraged to know that we're winning and taking ground. It's always hard to know. Just being a lay person, you hear the bad stories often on the news segments, but there's a lot of good things going on. So we'll remind our listeners one more time, if they want to get involved, how do they do that? How do they connect with you and the Parental Rights Foundation?
Absolutely. Well, our webpage is parentalrights.org. You can find out about the constitutional amendment we're working on. If you go to parentalrightsfoundation.org, you can see some of the cases, the amicus briefs that we've filed, some of the model legislation that we're working to rein in child welfare investigators who are trampling parental rights. You can follow me on Twitter at Will_Estrada, and of course, Parental Rights on Twitter as well. But thank you so much, Robert, for having us on.
Yeah, thank you so much, Will. And of course, they've got different laws going on in the states too, and we'll try to, if you're a member of Classical Conversations, keep you updated on any of the laws that they're pushing at the state level, because we want to make sure that your rights are not infringed on, even though they're natural rights. A lot of times governments tend to forget about those. So it's good to have it written down on paper somewhere.
The price of liberty is eternal vigilance.
Yes, thank you so much. All right, go check out those websites, get involved. Your rights are secured by God and the Second Amendment. So let's get at it. Thank you, Will.
Thank you, Robert.
All right, let's practice the 15 tools of learning together by talking about AI, artificial intelligence. This has been in the news, and in early May, it was in the news even more. 2 articles from CNBC, one on May 1st and one on May 2nd. The May 1st article says the godfather of AI is leaving Google. And on May 2nd, Chegg stock drops 40% after they cite the rise of ChatGPT and other AI services. For those who don't know, Chegg is a service that helps students with their homework. So let's pull some of these tools out from the article itself so we can see how different people are using them. And the first one is with Google's CEO, Sundar Pichai. And he said, when he was asked about the dangers of AI, he said, the pace of change can outstrip our ability to adapt. He said, I don't think so. We're sort of an infinitely adaptable species, he said. In other words, of course, he is a leader in the AI field, and he says that humanity will be able to adapt to whatever they come up with AI. Now, this is in stark contrast from Jeffrey Hinton, who's known as the godfather of AI, and he actually received his PhD in artificial intelligence over 45 years ago. He's a leader in the field. He's been consulting with Google for about a decade. And he said that where we are today, he basically said, I thought it was 30 to 50 years or even longer away. And obviously, I no longer think that. And so that's his testimony. And then in delivery, Hinton also said this in a CBS News article or interview in March. He said the chances of AI just wiping out humanity, he responded, it's not inconceivable. That's all I'll say. So, of course, he might be using hyperbolic messaging to get his point across. But a leader in this field who's been studying it for 45 years is really worried about it. And as I mentioned earlier, Chegg, which helps students with their homework, their stock has actually dropped 40% because of ChatGPT and other technologies that are now out there that students are using to help them complete their homework. So, of course, that's a big thing and a big issue in colleges and in high schools, or people who aren't homeschooling, how to figure out if a child is cheating or not using some of these services. The thing is, if you're listening to this podcast and you are using these 15 tools of learning in your everyday life, if you are practicing them, if you are integrating them into your work or into your homeschool curriculum, then you don't need to worry about AI because, like Sundar Pichai said, you have the tools and ability to adapt. It's those of us that rely on Google or rely on these tools that don't have an understanding that are going to be in trouble in the future. So be sure to keep listening to this podcast so we can keep practicing these 15 tools of learning together. Hello, everyone. I wanted to interrupt our show to tell you about STOA. It is a wonderful program. So if you're looking for an opportunity for your students to practice persuasive public speaking, critical thinking, and clear communication skills, consider STOA, a Christian homeschool speech and debate program for junior high and high school age homeschool students. STOA is on a mission to train homeschool students to speak boldly and change the world for Christ. Alongside their peers in a local STOA club and guided by a trained leader, your student can learn, practice, and become confident in the valuable lifelong skills of public speaking, research and writing, critical thinking, and Christian apologetics. To get started with STOA, visit stoausa.org/classical-conversations. That's stoausa.org/classical-conversations. Now let's get back to the show. Now let's talk a little bit about crypto and practice these tools of learning. Today, or earlier in this week, I started playing a game called HODL Up, HODL, which is a term that Bitcoiners and crypto people use. It's kind of like hold, but HODL, HODL. And it's a game to teach about Bitcoin mining and Bitcoin in general. It was created by a homeschooling family, and you can find out more at freemarketkids.com. This is not a paid promotion, but I had a lot of fun playing it. And as we explore Bitcoin and other cryptos, it's kind of hard to sometimes to think about it tangibly, and this is a way to do that. So for the 15 tools of learning in the 5 core habits of grammar, the tool of expressing, which is using the body and senses to share knowledge. A lot of times when we think about crypto, we think about zeros and ones and how it's something we can't touch. And this really brings it home. Now you're using, your sense of touch. You're obviously using your eye sense. I liked how I was able to express crypto and Bitcoin mining in a really tangible way. The tool of comparison, which is in the 5 common topics of dialectic. I think there is a lot of similarities between Bitcoin and homeschooling. And one of those similarities is that concept of self-custody, where us as parents or as homeschoolers, we are taking that education and not relying on someone else to do it. And the same thing happens in Bitcoin when we put our money into cold storage, which is something that you can do in the game. You're taking self-custody of that money. You're not relying on a bank or another third party to keep your money safe, that you have taken that responsibility into your own hands, just like we have taken homeschooling into our own hands and those responsibilities. And finally, style, which is one of the 5 canons of rhetoric. And learning Bitcoin and about crypto through a game is a great way to present these ideas, to introduce individuals who may not know about Bitcoin or might be hesitant to learn about zeros and ones and what is this crazy internet money. When you really simplify it into a game form, it does a great job capturing the essence of Bitcoin mining, the Bitcoin cycles, which we will talk about the next time I talk about crypto. And really, it's a great way if you don't know anything about Bitcoin. You can go to their website, freemarketkids.com, and pick up the game HODL Up to learn all about it. So again, not a paid advertisement, but a way for us as maybe crypto novices or people who are trying to learn about it and teach others, a great way to introduce it to friends and family in a fun way. And it's just not about Bitcoin or Bitcoin mining. It's also just a really fun game to play over and over again with your family. So can't recommend it enough. And those are the 3 tools that we're practicing today: expressing, compare, and style. All right. Thank you so much. And be sure to tune in next time as we continue to explore this other world of finance and learn about money. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. If you had as much fun as I did, be sure to subscribe and please share it with a friend, especially someone who's a parent. It's so important that we all get involved in securing our rights so that we can raise our children in the love and admonition of the Lord. All right, we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to Refining Rhetoric with Robert Bortons. Want more? Make sure to subscribe so you won't miss an episode. You can also follow us on social media to continue the conversation and visit classicalconversations.com/rhetoric to find out how you can join a local homeschool community.